Last week, this channel published a video about New England stone walls. The video used the standard mileage estimate of 252,000 miles. Within 24 hours, viewers in the comments flagged the number as too low. The University of Connecticut estimates the real mileage between 240,000 and 800,000 miles, depending on whether buried walls are counted. The viewers are right. 800,000 miles is the upper bound. Today, we walk through the actual labor it took to clear that much stone by hand. 800,000 miles. That number deserves to be said out loud and slowly. 800,000 miles of stone walls, built by hand, across the New England states and reaching as far south as the Virginia Tidewater and as far west as the Pennsylvania Ridge Country. Each wall is roughly 4 feet high, 3 feet wide, made of irregular glacial erratic boulders fitted together without mortar. Total weight of cleared stone is estimated at 240 million tons. That is more material moved by hand than the entire pre-mechanized earthworks of the Erie Canal, more than the entire transcontinental railroad cuttings before dynamite, more than the Panama Canal hand era's full spoil. New England farmers did this work over roughly 80 years, between 1810 and 1890, by clearing their fields one stone at a time, day after day, generation after generation. The walls survive today because nothing in the New England environment is strong enough to move them. They are still in the second growth forests, running through suburban backyards, crossing state highways, dividing former farms that have been abandoned for 120 years. The reason the walls exist at all is geology. About 15,000 years ago, the Laurentide ice sheet that covered most of the northeastern United States during the last ice age began to retreat. The retreating ice carried with it the boulders, gravel, and rock fragments it had been grinding off the bedrock for the previous 50,000 years. As the ice melted, it deposited those rocks across the New England landscape in a chaotic mix. Some boulders were dropped on bedrock, some were buried under glacial till, a mix of clay, sand, and gravel. Some were left at the surface of the new soil layer. The rocks were of every size, from gravel to multi-ton boulders, and of every type, from granite to gneiss to schist. The total volume of glacial erratic boulders deposited across New England by the retreating ice is estimated at over 300 million tons. That stone is still there. Most of it is in the soil. Some of it is at the surface. All of it has to come out of the way before a farmer can plow a field. When European colonists started farming New England in the 1630s and 1640s, the rock problem was immediately obvious. Every field they cleared had stones in it. Every plowing season brought new stones to the surface, because the freeze-thaw cycle pushed buried rocks upward each winter. The farmers had a specific term for the new stones that appeared each spring. They called them spring potatoes. That term is preserved in the comment thread on last week's Stone Walls video on this channel, where one of the viewers used the phrase directly. The viewers are right that the term was widely used by New England farm families through the 19th century. Spring potatoes. The stones that grew up out of the ground every winter as if they were a crop. The farmers needed to do something with the spring potatoes. The simplest solution was to pile them at the edge of the field. That is what happened for the first 2 or 3 generations of New England farming. The piles got larger every year as more stones came out of the soil. By the 1700s, the piles had become walls. Not because anybody had decided to build a wall, but because the most efficient way to store cleared stone was to stack it in a linear pile along the field boundary, where it would not block plowing or grazing. The walls grew up out of the field clearing process organically. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, the walls were a recognized New England landscape feature. By the 1820s and 1830s, deliberate wall building had become a regional craft, with specific techniques for height, width, gate placement, and corner construction. If you appreciate the depth of these American industrial heritage stories and want to support more of them, join at the Boss tier for early access and members-only polls, or Final Boss for member shoutouts and members-only videos. Link is in the description below. Now we walk through what wall building actually looked like in practice across 5 generations of New England farm families. The labor was distributed across the entire farm family. Fathers and adult sons did the heavy lifting on the largest boulders, using iron pry bars, wooden levers, and ox teams pulling stone boats. A stone boat was a low wooden sled, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, dragged across the field on its flat bottom rather than on wheels. The flat bottom let the boat slide over rough ground that would have stopped a wheeled wagon. The boat had a heavy, iron-shod noseplate that could be slid under a stone after the men had pried it part of the way out of the soil. Then the ox team pulled the loaded boat to the wall site. Mothers and adult daughters typically did the smaller stone work, sorting and carrying medium-sized stones in baskets or hand barrows. Children of working age, which in 19th century farm New England meant about age 6 and up, did the smallest stones, gathering them into piles and bringing them to the wall site for the adults to fit into the wall. The work happened year-round, but peaked in the early spring and late fall, when the soil was soft enough to dig, but the fields were not under cultivation. Average daily labor on stone clearing across the farm family was estimated at about 1 hour per person per day during the peak periods, dropping to perhaps 15 minutes per person per day during planting and harvest seasons. The wall construction itself was a particular craft. A typical New England stone wall is what masons call a double-faced, dry-stacked wall. The wall has 2 outer faces, one on each side of the line. Between the faces is a fill of smaller stones, broken stones, and gravel. The faces are built by selecting stones that have a relatively flat outer surface, then fitting those stones one on top of another in a way that locks each stone into the wall through gravity, friction, and the offset positioning of the next stone above. No mortar, no cement, no iron pins. Just gravity, friction, and the skill of the wall builder. A well-built, dry-stacked wall can stand for hundreds of years. A poorly built, dry-stacked wall will start to slump within 10 or 20 years, and will be a low pile of stones within 50. The difference between a good wall and a bad wall is the skill of the wall builder and the quality of the available stone. New England farmers in the 1820s through 1850s were generally good wall builders. The walls they built are mostly still standing today. New England farmers in the 1870s through 1890s, the late period when the farm economy was already collapsing, were sometimes less careful. The walls they built are mostly still standing too, but with more slump and more collapsed sections. If you are new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you do not miss the next video. We publish 2 videos per day this week. Now we walk through the economic story behind the walls, which is the part that most popular accounts of New England stone walls leave out. The popular image of the New England stone wall is that it was a property boundary marker, built to delineate one farm from another. That image is mostly wrong. Most New England stone walls were not property boundaries. They were livestock containment fences, specifically built to hold sheep. From about 1810 through about 1860, New England farming shifted from mixed crop and livestock production toward heavily concentrated sheep grazing for the textile industry. The textile mills of the Connecticut River Valley, the Merrimack River Valley, and southern New England needed wool. Sheep need pasture. Pasture needs fencing. The fences had to be tall enough to keep sheep in, sturdy enough to resist sheep pressure, and cheap enough to be built and maintained on a farm budget. Stone walls met all 3 criteria. The walls were typically 4 to 5 feet tall, the right height to keep sheep from jumping over. They were 3 feet wide at the base, the right width to resist sheep crowding pressure. And they cost almost nothing in cash. The stones were already in the field. The labor was the farm family. Sheep, unlike goats, do not climb. Sheep will walk along a wall looking for a low point or an open gate, but they will not attempt to scale a wall. Goats will scale almost any wall. Cattle will press against walls and eventually push them down. But sheep, the dominant New England livestock from 1810 through 1860, would not. The stone walls of New England were built for sheep specifically. The wall height, width, gate design, and corner construction reflected sheep behavior. If you look at New England stone walls in detail today, you can sometimes still see the small wooden sheep gate frames preserved in the wall openings, or the iron staples in the wall stones where sheep gate hinges once attached. The textile industry collapsed after the Civil War, when Southern cotton replaced New England wool as the dominant textile fiber, ended the New England sheep industry. The walls remained, but the sheep were gone. The other reason for wall building that popular accounts mostly miss is that wall building was a way to store cleared stone. The walls served as the disposal pile for the stones being removed from the field. They were as much a waste management system as a fencing system. New England farmers did not have a place to put the stones except along the field edge. The walls were not built deliberately as walls. They accumulated as the storage location for the stones the farmers had to move every year. The fact that they could function as sheep fences and as occasional property boundaries was a useful byproduct, not the primary motivation. The volume of stone moved across the 5 generations of New England farm families is staggering. Modern Robert Thorson studies at the University of Connecticut estimate that the cumulative stone-moving labor across New England between 1810 and 1890 totals roughly 240 million tons. That figure includes stones moved into walls, stones moved into rock piles, stones moved into building foundations, stones moved into bridge abutments, stones moved into road surfaces, and stones moved into other agricultural infrastructure. The walls themselves account for the largest single category, with an estimated 180 million tons of stone moved specifically into wall construction. The rest went to foundations, road material, and bridge work. The total cumulative labor required to move 240 million tons of stone by hand across 80 years is hard to estimate precisely, but the best estimate puts it at roughly 300 million person-hours of farm family labor. That equals about 750,000 person-years of full-time work, spread across roughly 2.5 million farm family members across the New England region. The regional variation in stone wall construction across New England is also worth noting. Vermont and New Hampshire have the highest documented stone wall density per square mile, primarily because the soils in those states had the highest concentration of glacial erratic boulders in the easily accessible upper soil layers. Eastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island have somewhat lower densities, partly because the underlying glacial geology deposited fewer surface boulders, and partly because the agricultural economy in those regions shifted earlier toward urban supplying market farming, where field walls were less necessary. Connecticut has a wide range of wall densities, with the highest in the Litchfield Hills and the lowest in the Connecticut River Valley. Maine has substantial stone wall mileage in the southern coastal counties, but much less in the interior, where forest agriculture predominated over field agriculture. The total New England stone wall mileage by state, based on Thorson's recent estimates, breaks down roughly as follows. Vermont accounts for approximately 160,000 miles of walls. New Hampshire accounts for approximately 120,000 miles. Massachusetts accounts for approximately 190,000 miles. Connecticut accounts for approximately 140,000 miles. Rhode Island accounts for approximately 20,000 miles, despite the state's small total area. Maine accounts for approximately 100,000 miles. The combined Thorson estimate for the 6 New England states is approximately 730,000 miles, near the upper bound of the 240 to 800,000 mile range. The extensions of the New England stone wall tradition into adjacent regions also need mention. The Pennsylvania Ridge Country, particularly Lycoming and Sullivan counties in north-central Pennsylvania, has substantial stone wall mileage built by farm families with New England origins who migrated south during the early 1800s. The Hudson Valley of New York, the Catskills, and the Adirondack foothills have New England-style stone walls built by farmers who moved west into those regions during the same period. The northern New Jersey ridges, particularly Sussex and Warren counties, have similar walls. Even the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia has small areas of New England-style stone wall construction built by New England farm families who migrated south during the mid-19th century. The Ozark Mountains of Arkansas have isolated examples of New England-style stone wall construction in counties where Vermont and New Hampshire migrants settled in the 1850s and 1860s. The total wall mileage in these adjacent extension regions is probably another 70 to 100,000 miles beyond the 6 New England states proper. The combined American stone wall tradition that traces back to New England farming labor between 1810 and 1890 probably reaches 800 to 900,000 miles total, which is closer to the upper bound flagged in last week's viewer comments. The mileage estimate is the part that this video is specifically here to correct. The historical published figure of 252,000 miles comes from a U.S. Department of Agriculture census study published in 1871. The 1871 figure was based on field-by-field tallies submitted by county-level agricultural agents across New England. That figure has been treated as the canonical number for the last 150 years. Robert Thorson and his team at the University of Connecticut have spent the last 20 years resurveying the actual stone walls using a combination of LiDAR aerial mapping, ground truth field walks, and archival records. The Thorson estimate produces a range of 240,000 miles on the low end to 800,000 miles on the high end. The difference between the two numbers is whether you count walls that have been mostly buried in second-growth forest leaf litter, or whether you require the walls to be visible above ground. The low number counts only visible walls. The high number counts visible walls plus buried walls that can be detected by LiDAR or by careful field walking. The viewers in last week's comment thread were correct that the 1871 figure of 252,000 miles is too low. The real number, including buried walls, is closer to 800,000 miles. 800,000. By hand. 5 generations of farm families. 240 million tons of stone moved. Anyone who has seen the masonry on a 150-year-old wall knows this. The work was not just labor. It was a generational commitment. New England farm families understood that the stone clearing work would never end. The spring potatoes would keep coming up every winter for as long as the field was farmed. The walls would keep growing as long as the stones kept coming. The family that started a farm in 1770 and worked it through 5 generations had moved millions of pounds of stone by the time the last generation gave up the farm and moved west in the 1880s. The walls they left behind were the physical record of that family's labor, generation after generation, season after season. The walls are still there. The families are mostly gone. The land has mostly returned to forest. The walls remain. The wall builders themselves followed regional craft traditions that varied across New England. In northern Vermont and New Hampshire, the wall building tradition favored what masons call field stone walls, with stones used essentially as nature delivered them, without much shaping or splitting. The walls in those regions tend to be relatively low, often only 3 to 4 feet high, with rounded boulder-style stones fitted together for stability. In central Massachusetts and Connecticut, where the local glacial geology delivered more angular and split-faced stones, wall builders developed what masons call broken-face wall styles, with carefully selected flat-face stones forming neat exterior surfaces. The Massachusetts and Connecticut broken-face walls are typically taller, often 5 to 6 feet, and more carefully constructed. In coastal Maine and the Connecticut River Valley, hybrid styles developed combining fieldstone bulk fill with broken face exterior-facing stones. Each regional tradition required slightly different selection methods at the field clearing stage, slightly different stacking techniques at the wall building stage, and slightly different maintenance approaches over the wall's service life. The regional knowledge was transmitted through farm family apprenticeship, with sons learning the local wall building style from their fathers and grandfathers across the generations. Most of that knowledge is now lost. The wall building craft as a living tradition in New England effectively ended with the farm abandonment of the late 19th century. Modern stone wall restoration work in New England relies on a small number of professional dry stone wall masons, most of them trained through the Stonewall Initiative at the University of Connecticut, or through small private apprenticeship programs in Vermont and Massachusetts. The total number of working dry stone masons in New England today is probably under 300. The walls outnumber the people who could build them by ratios that approach infinity. There is a strain of New England stone wall history that needs separate acknowledgement. Some of the stone walls in the New England landscape were not built by colonial-era and 19th century farm families. Some of them were built by Native American communities in the centuries before European contact. The pre-contact stone building tradition of the Eastern Algonquian peoples included stone chambers, stone enclosures, and stone wall sections used for ceremonial purposes and for territorial markers. Modern archaeological research has documented pre-contact stone wall sections in Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island that predate the colonial era. The exact mileage of pre-contact stone wall construction is unknown, but the archaeology suggests it is a small fraction of the total New England stone wall mileage. Most of the walls are colonial and post-colonial era, but not all. The audience comments on last week's Stone Walls video specifically flagged this point. The viewers are correct that the pre-contact stone tradition deserves acknowledgement. The Eastern Algonquian peoples were stone builders before the colonial era began. The wider role of stone in the New England farm economy goes beyond just the walls. Stone foundations were the universal base for New England farmhouses, barns, spring houses, smokehouses, and corn cribs throughout the 19th century. Stone retaining walls held up the steep hillside fields that characterize much of upland New England agriculture. Stone bridges, often single-arch fieldstone bridges over small streams, were the standard rural road crossing technology through the 1850s and 1860s. Stone milestone markers, fence post anchors, well linings, and root cellars were universal across the region. The stone was free if you were willing to do the labor. The wood was cheap, the iron was expensive. The brick was expensive in most regions. So 19th century New England farm families built almost everything they could out of stone and wood, including features that in other regions of the United States would have been built out of brick, concrete, or sawn lumber. The aggregate stone consumption across these uses, beyond just the walls, probably added another 60 to 80 million tons of cleared stone to the cumulative volume. Add that to the 180 million tons that went into the walls themselves, and the total New England stone movement between 1810 and 1890 reaches the 240 million ton figure cited in the modern Thorson estimates. The economic value of the stone-moving labor, if calculated at the prevailing 19th century farm labor wage rates, would have been substantial, even at the low rates of the period. New England farm labor in the 1830s earned roughly 75 cents to $1 per day for hired hands. Family labor on the home farm was uncompensated cash-wise, but the opportunity cost was real. If the cumulative 300 million person-hours of stone-clearing labor across the New England farm families had been compensated at the prevailing hired hand rate, the total cost would have been approximately $30 to $40 million in mid-19th century currency. In modern equivalent purchasing power, that figure equals roughly $1 billion to $1.5 billion. The walls represent that much investment of family farm labor across 5 generations. Most of that labor was uncompensated and uncommemorated. The walls remain as the only physical evidence that the work was ever done. The transition from sheep pasture economy to dairy economy in New England between approximately 1850 and 1870 changed the wall construction patterns even before the broader farm abandonment of the late 19th century. Dairy cattle require different fencing than sheep. Cattle press against fences with their full weight and will eventually push down any wall that is not built to higher specifications. The transition to dairy economy required either rebuilding existing sheep walls to higher and wider specifications, or supplementing the walls with wooden rail fence components, or installing newer iron wire fencing technology that began to appear in New England in the 1860s. Many New England stone walls have layered construction that shows this transition history. The lower courses of the wall may date to the 1820s or 1830s original sheep pasture construction. The upper courses, often more roughly built with smaller stones, may date to the 1850s or 1860s dairy transition construction. The wooden rail fence components are mostly gone today, having rotted in place after the farm abandonment. But the iron staples in the wall stones, where the rails once attached, are sometimes still visible. The end of the New England wall building era came with the abandonment of New England farms after the Civil War. The opening of the western United States to migration meant that New England farm families had a choice. They could continue farming the stony, marginal New England soils, or they could move west to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and Kansas, where the soils were deeper, the fields were larger, and the rocks were absent or much smaller. Most families that had a choice moved west. The Vermont census of 1900 recorded that more than half of the state's farms had been abandoned to forest since 1860. The same pattern held in New Hampshire, Maine, western Massachusetts, and eastern Connecticut. Across the New England region, more than 200,000 farms were abandoned between 1865 and 1900. The fields were left to grow back into forest. The stone walls remained. The LiDAR mapping technology that Robert Thorson and his team at the University of Connecticut have been using to survey New England stone walls deserves separate technical description because it has revolutionized the historical understanding of the wall mileage. LiDAR, which stands for Light Detection and Ranging, is a remote sensing technology that uses laser pulses to measure ground surface elevation with extraordinary precision. Modern LiDAR systems mounted on aircraft can produce ground elevation maps with vertical accuracy of approximately 3 to 6 inches across hundreds of square miles per survey flight. The Thorson team has used Connecticut State LiDAR data combined with field verification walks to identify approximately 140,000 miles of stone walls in Connecticut alone, substantially more than the historical 1871 estimates had recognized. The LiDAR data reveals stone walls that have been completely buried in forest leaf litter, walls that have collapsed and become difficult to see from the ground but remain detectable as linear features in the precise elevation data, and walls that cross through wetland areas where field walking is impractical. The technology has fundamentally changed the historical understanding of New England's stone wall extent. The second-growth forests that now cover most of New England grew up around the stone walls over the next century. The walls are now mostly buried in leaf litter, root systems, and accumulated forest floor debris. Most of the stone wall mileage in New England today is not visible from a road or a trail. It is in the forest, partially overgrown, often only revealed by careful field walking or by LiDAR scanning. The Thorson estimate of 800,000 miles includes all of those forest-buried walls. The historical 1871 figure of 252,000 miles did not include them, because in 1871, the forests had not yet grown back. The fields were still mostly fields. The walls were mostly visible. The undercount in the 1870s was real but understandable. The real undercount is the modern continuation of the 1870s number, which has been published in textbooks and tourist guides and encyclopedic references for the last 150 years, without being updated to reflect the actual mileage that the second-growth forest hides. Before we close, if this kind of pre-modern engineering story is what you came for, the Final Boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos, plus your name and upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end. 70% of the walls still survive today, buried in second-growth forest or running through suburban backyards from Maine to Pennsylvania and reaching as far as the Virginia Tidewater and the Arkansas Ozarks. 5 generations of New England farm families cleared 240 million tons of stone by hand. That is more material moved by hand than the Erie Canal earthworks, more than the entire pre-mechanized transcontinental railroad cuttings, more than the Panama Canal hand-era spoil. The walls are still there. The families that built them are mostly buried in the small cemeteries beside them. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren are still in the comments on this channel, leaving messages about the walls their grandfathers built, or the stones their grandmothers carried as children. The audience itself flagged the 1871 mileage figure as an undercount, and the audience was right. The real number is closer to 800,000 miles. The records prove it. The walls remain,